take a breath, because what I'm about to share with you might be the missing piece behind everything you've been feeling, everything that's been sitting quietly in the back of your mind without a name. Something is changing right now in your life. You probably can't point to it exactly. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't make a sound, but it's real and it's already in motion. And the most interesting part, it started the moment you made one quiet, almost invisible decision. You stopped going after someone. No argument, no tearful conversation, no grand exit. You simply withdrew. You pulled your energy back, and that one shift, as understated as it felt in the moment, set something into motion that you may not fully appreciate yet. Think about the person on the other side of that. They've grown so comfortable with your presence, so accustomed to your energy moving toward them, that they never had to think much about any of it. You were always there, always reaching, always making yourself available. And now, for maybe the first time, that's gone. Not replaced by something loud, just gone. And what fills that space is silence. And silence, when it replaces something that used to be consistent, doesn't feel like nothing. It feels like something very specific that's hard to name but impossible to ignore. Right now, whether you're aware of it or not, something is stirring in them. Questions are forming. Feelings they didn't expect are starting to surface. Because for the first time, they're experiencing you without the cushion of your effort, softening everything. And that is not a small thing. That changes the entire shape of what was between you. This isn't about revenge. It's not about pride or making someone feel bad. It's about something much quieter and much more honest than any of that. It's about what becomes visible when you stop covering the truth with your own constant effort. Here's what was actually happening before you stepped back. The connection between you two had a kind of momentum, but it wasn't balanced momentum. It was being powered almost entirely by you. Your messages, your attention, your emotional availability, all of it was flowing in one direction, and that one-directional flow created a very comfortable setup for them. They didn't need to ask themselves hard questions. They didn't need to decide how they felt or what they wanted. They didn't need to show up with any real intention because you were already filling every gap before it had a chance to feel empty. That's a surprisingly easy position to settle into without even realizing it. When someone else's effort is holding everything together, you don't feel the weight of the structure at all. You just exist inside it. The moment you stopped, the weight became visible. The structure that was being held up by your energy simply couldn't hold itself up anymore. Not because anything dramatic happened, but because the force maintaining it was gone, and what was stable before now feels uncertain. That shift in stability, that move from predictable to unpredictable, is something the human mind cannot passively accept. It immediately wants to understand what changed and why. This is the moment the dynamic quietly begins to flip. Before, their attention was essentially passive. They received without needing to give anything back because there was nothing pulling them toward action. Now, without your energy pushing the connection forward, their attention shifts from passive to active. They start noticing your absence in a way they never noticed your presence. And that asymmetry, being more aware of what's gone than what was always there, is one of the more quietly powerful things about human psychology. Your silence begins to carry weight. Not because silence itself has power, but because it breaks a pattern they were counting on without realizing it. There was an expectation. You would reach out, you would follow up, you would show up as you always did. When that expectation goes unmet, something opens up inside them, a gap. And in that gap, questions start to form, not always consciously, but they form. They begin replaying things, turning small moments over in their mind, looking for the detail that explains what changed. This isn't yet about missing you in a deep sense. It's about the disruption of something they assumed was fixed. People are more attached to emotional patterns than they realize. When you remove yourself from a pattern you've been part of consistently, the other person is suddenly standing in territory they didn't prepare for. That's when the emotional imbalance that always existed gets exposed. The gap between how much you were giving and how little they were contributing is no longer being hidden by your effort. The connection now asks something of them. It requires their participation in a way it never did before. And for someone who's grown comfortable in a dynamic where they never had to give much, that requirement can feel surprisingly unfamiliar. There's also something happening at a deeper level, something that touches the ego. When someone is regularly pursued, that pursuit quietly reinforces their sense of value. Your attention was functioning as a mirror, reflecting their importance back to them on a consistent basis. When you stop, that mirror disappears. They don't necessarily feel worthless, but they do start to question where that sense of importance was actually coming from. They begin to wonder if they misread things, if they assumed too much, if something they thought was permanently available might not be anymore. And here's something else your silence accomplishes that nothing you could have said would. It lifts the weight off your shoulders and transfers it to theirs. You were the one doing the work, driving things forward, carrying the emotional labor. Now that's no longer yours to carry. The quiet you've created puts them in the position of having to choose, step forward or stay still. And because your presence is no longer nudging them in any direction, whatever they decide carries real meaning. It's their choice, uninfluenced. What makes this entire shift so honest is that none of it is manufactured. You didn't engineer a reaction. You didn't create tension through drama or confrontation. You simply stepped back, and in doing so, you allowed the situation to show its own truth. Without your effort artificially sustaining things, what remains is the clearest possible answer to one simple question. How much is this person actually willing to give when no one is doing it for them? When you stop being the one who always fills the silence, something opens up that didn't exist before. A space. And in that space, they're no longer being carried by your energy. They're standing on their own, with their own thoughts, their own feelings, and no external input from you to lean on. That's where real reflection begins, not by choice necessarily, but by circumstance. Before your silence, their entire experience of the connection was shaped by what you did. You initiated. You maintained the rhythm. You signaled your interest clearly and consistently. Because of that, they never had any reason to go searching inside themselves for answers. You were the signal, steady and reliable. But when a signal that's been steady suddenly goes quiet, the mind doesn't accept it as neutral. It registers it as something that needs to be understood. At first, the silence just feels slightly off. They might find themselves checking their phone a little more than usual, not for anything specific, just because something in the rhythm feels broken. That vague discomfort is actually the first stage of reflection. The pattern they trusted has been interrupted, and the mind wants to figure out why. As more time passes, the silence stops feeling like a pause and starts feeling deliberate. Even if you never said a word about what you were doing, the perception of intention changes things. They begin to wonder if they did something that caused this, if something shifted in how you feel, if what they thought was solid is quietly coming apart. These thoughts don't follow logic, they follow emotion, and they grow. From there, the mind starts going backward, revisiting old conversations, re-examining small moments that seemed unremarkable at the time. The tone of something you said, a moment where things felt slightly different. These memories don't surface because they've suddenly become more thoughtful. They surface because with no new input from you, memory becomes the only material available. And memory, when it's all that remains, tends to hit with more weight than it did in the moment. The stillness your absence creates draws out emotions that were being held just below the surface. When everything was active and ongoing, there was no pressure to stop and feel anything deeply. The momentum kept everything moving. Silence interrupts that momentum. It forces a kind of stillness, and in stillness, feelings rise more clearly. A sense of loss that doesn't have a clean definition yet, a quiet curiosity about what actually changed, and sometimes something that sits uncomfortably close to regret, especially when they start to realize they didn't fully value what was consistently offered to them. Silence also strips something away that your presence was quietly providing: external reassurance. When you were there, consistently present and engaged, your attention was telling them without words that everything was fine, that they were secure, that the connection was intact. Without that, they no longer have anything to confirm where they stand, and that absence of confirmation pushes them inward, Instead of relying on you to define the meaning of the connection, they have to start building that definition themselves, from the inside. One of the things that makes silence so psychologically interesting is that it doesn't ask anything directly. There's no confrontation to respond to, no question that demands an answer. This matters because when people are challenged directly, their first instinct is usually defensive. But silence doesn't give them anything to push against. It just exists. And that gives their thoughts room to develop without any pressure shaping them, which leads to something more genuinely honest than almost any conversation could. That said, the stillness isn't always comfortable to sit in. Some people don't know how to be alone with uncertain feelings. They'll distract themselves, stay busy, mentally minimize the connection to protect themselves from having to feel the weight of it. But even in avoidance, the awareness doesn't fully go away. It lingers in the background, waiting. And that lingering is what keeps the reflection alive, not as a single moment of clarity, but as a slow accumulation that builds over time. Each day without contact adds a little more weight to what they're quietly carrying. Each quiet moment reinforces that something real has changed. There's something particular about how the mind responds to someone who has always been present and then suddenly isn't. When someone is always available, always there, the mind stops treating their presence as something precious. It gets filed away as background, as a given. Not because the connection means nothing, but because familiarity does something to urgency. What feels permanent stops feeling valuable in the moment. Absence breaks that spell. It removes the certainty that was being taken for granted. The person who barely thought about the dynamic before is now thinking about it constantly. The background has moved to the foreground. One of the less obvious things presence does is act as an emotional buffer. When someone knows you're consistently there, they don't feel the urgency to examine what you mean to them. Your availability is a kind of comfort that lets them postpone going deeper. Absence removes that postponement. They can no longer rely on the next interaction to keep the feeling of connection alive. They have to draw on what genuinely exists inside them. And that internal drawing is where vague emotions start to become specific ones. They might begin to notice patterns they glossed over before. How rarely they were the one to reach out first. How much your presence shaped the way they felt without them consciously acknowledging it. These aren't new feelings being created. Absence doesn't manufacture emotion. It reveals what was already there by removing the noise that had been sitting on top of it. Absence also introduces something that constant presence rarely allows, a real, tangible sense that something could be lost. When someone is always there, losing them feels theoretical. But when they're no longer there in the same way, that possibility becomes concrete. The mind begins to genuinely consider what it would mean if this absence were permanent. And that consideration does something powerful. It makes the value of what existed feel sharper than it ever did while it was right in front of them. When you stop chasing, the first thing that tends to move through the other person isn't sadness or longing, it's confusion. They were used to a rhythm, a flow they could depend on. That rhythm gave them a kind of stability they never had to think about. When it stops, the mind scrambles for an explanation. Simple but persistent questions start surfacing. What changed? Did I do something? Is something wrong? The confusion isn't just about the situation itself. It's about losing a clarity they were relying on without ever naming it. As that confusion sits with them, curiosity grows alongside it. The mind doesn't tolerate unresolved uncertainty well. It reaches for answers. They start paying attention to small things they would have ignored before. They revisit old conversations looking for clues. They notice your activity, or the absence of it, in ways they never would have before. Curiosity pulls their attention toward you with an intensity that simply didn't exist when everything was predictable. Running underneath all of this, usually just below the surface, is a quiet anxiety. Not the loud, obvious kind. More like a background tension that colors everything slightly. Your presence had been providing a form of reassurance they weren't consciously aware of receiving. Without it, the mind begins entertaining possibilities it had previously set aside. Are they losing your interest? Has something changed that they missed? These thoughts create an unease that changes how present they are to their own inner experience. Part of what feeds this anxiety is the loss of control. When you were pursuing them, they held a comfortable amount of influence. They could respond on their own timeline, engage as much or as little as they chose, and still trust that you'd be there. When you stop, that certainty dissolves. They can no longer predict your behavior, and the mind becomes unsettled when it loses the ability to anticipate what comes next. There's also a shift in how they see themselves. Your attention had been quietly reinforcing their sense of importance. When it withdraws, that quiet reinforcement stops. They begin to question things they hadn't thought to question before. Did they read your feelings correctly? Did they overestimate their place in your life? None of this crashes in all at once. It just slowly shifts. These feelings tend to create an internal conflict. Part of them wants to reach out, to resolve the uncertainty and get back to solid ground. But another part hesitates, held back by pride or fear, or simply not wanting to be the one who blinks first. That conflict amplifies everything else. The confusion lingers because there's no clear action to resolve it. The anxiety builds because there's no resolution in sight. What matters most about all of this is what it does to their role in the dynamic. For the first time, they've moved from passive to active, at least internally. They're no longer just receiving. They're processing, questioning, feeling the full weight of what's no longer there. And even if they don't act right away, their internal state has changed. That change will shape everything that comes next. When your energy is no longer flowing towards someone, they lose the external force that was quietly shaping how they experience the connection. Before, your consistency was doing something important. It was carrying the momentum. It was filling the gaps. It was making it easy for them to stay comfortable without contributing much. Once you step back, that ease disappears. The connection is no longer something happening around them. It's something they have to actually reckon with. And this reckoning, as internal as it is, can feel strange to someone who's never had to carry their share of the emotional weight. Being comfortable in an imbalanced dynamic tends to dull the awareness of just how imbalanced things were. When your effort is removed, that imbalance becomes undeniable. They start to see their own behavior through a different lens, how rarely they initiated, how much they assumed would always be there. These realizations don't come as perfectly articulated thoughts. They come as a quiet, persistent awareness. Your absence is functioning as a mirror that reflects their own level of investment back to them, without you needing to say a single word about it. If what they felt was real, if the connection genuinely meant something deeper than they'd let themselves acknowledge, your absence will pull that to the surface. They'll feel the specific weight of not having you there in a way they couldn't when your presence was constant. They'll understand what you actually meant to them, not through something you said, but through the experience of what life feels like without you in it. If what they felt was more surface level, sustained more by your effort than by genuine depth on their part, that truth will become clear too. Without your energy holding things together, the intensity won't grow. It will fade, and that fading will tell them something they may not have wanted to know. Your absence doesn't create emotions. It exposes the ones that were already there, underneath everything. When the space you've created demands a response, the quality of that response comes down entirely to who they are. A person with real emotional maturity doesn't run from the discomfort your absence creates. They turn toward it. They examine it. They become curious about what it's telling them rather than trying to get away from it. They look honestly at their own past behavior, how little they gave, how much they leaned on you, how many times they avoided making a clear choice when they had every opportunity to make one. That honest look can bring something important, a sense of responsibility. A shift from focusing on what they might be losing to understanding what they never properly contributed. From that place, if they value what was between you, they move toward it with purpose. Not impulsively, not just to end the discomfort, but because they've genuinely arrived somewhere clearer inside themselves. The way they show up changes, more direct, more honest, less dependent on you holding up the whole thing. Someone without that maturity responds differently. The same space that opens one person up closes another one down. Instead of looking inward, they look outward for escape. They distract themselves. They minimize the connection to avoid sitting with the feeling. Some will interpret your absence as rejection and pull further away to protect themselves, creating more distance not because the connection was meaningless, but because facing it requires a vulnerability they aren't ready for. Some will simply wait. Not peacefully, but stubbornly, waiting for you to go back to how you were, hoping the dynamic resets without them having to move or change anything. That kind of waiting is rooted in resistance, and it very often leads to losing the connection entirely, not because neither person cared, but because one of them refused to look honestly at their own role in it. What all of this makes clear is that your absence, unplanned as it was, functions as a kind of natural test. Not something you designed, but something that emerged organically from the situation, and it reveals more clearly than anything you could have said or done whether this person is capable of genuine growth or whether they'll stay exactly where they've always been. In the end, the only thing that truly changed was your energy. You stopped chasing, and in that one quiet act, you made room for the truth. Everything that was being hidden beneath your effort and your consistency is now visible. Their response, whatever form it takes, is simply a reflection of who they are when no one is carrying them anymore. Some will surprise you, some won't, but either way, you'll finally have a real answer. Not because you forced one, but because you stopped preventing one from forming. That's where your real power lives. Not in the pursuit, not in trying harder or saying the right thing. It lives in the willingness to step back and let what's real reveal itself. Because what genuinely belongs in your life will find its way toward you, and what never truly did will quietly fall away, leaving behind something more valuable than any answer you could have chased. This is the shift from emotional chasing to emotional clarity, from tightening your grip on uncertainty to loosening it enough for truth to breathe. When you stop trying to force a connection to behave differently than it naturally does, you begin to see it without distortion. No more filling silence with imagination. No more interpreting inconsistency as potential. Just the simple, sometimes uncomfortable reality of what is actually being offered back to you. And in that space, something subtle but powerful happens. You begin to notice your own energy again. The parts of you that were constantly scanning, waiting, hoping, adjusting, softening, over-explaining. You see how much of yourself was being spent trying to stabilize something that was never fully stable to begin with. Not because the connection had no meaning, but because meaning alone is not the same as mutual capacity. Stepping back is not indifference, it is precision. It is the decision to stop pouring effort into a system that only functions when you abandon yourself. It is the moment you stop negotiating your worth through someone else's inconsistency. And strangely, this is often where emotional truth becomes loudest, not in what returns, but in what no longer requires chasing. Because what is real does not need to be hunted. It responds to alignment, not pressure. It moves toward mutual readiness, not emotional strain. And what is not real, or not ready, does not survive contact with stillness. It fades not out of punishment, but out of exposure. There is no performance left to sustain it. So what remains after the chasing ends is clarity. Sometimes it is connection returning in a healthier form, where both people meet differently than before. Sometimes it is acceptance that the bond existed, but not in a way that can be carried forward. Either way, you are no longer trapped inside guessing. You are standing in truth instead of interpretation. And that is the quiet strength here. Not control, not influence, but self-return. The moment you choose yourself enough to stop abandoning your own life for the sake of uncertainty, you don't lose something essential. You recover it. It leaves you with the truth.